Subcommittee on Probation and Parole, questioning and searches to order. We have with us today the other committee members, Commissioner Allamby and Commissioner Roberts, as well as Lieutenant Dan Montgomery in attendance, and I'm Chair, Commissioner Kitty Calavita. At this time, I'll open it up for public comment. Is there any public comment?
Can I reserve?
Sorry, you're behind me. What?
Can we reserve till the end?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, approval of the agenda. Would one of you like to move approving the agenda?
So moved.
Good.
And seconded?
Huh?
And seconded?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We could do it by consensus or something, yeah.
Yeah. And so we just moved directly to old business, which is consideration of the Berkeley Department policy with regard to probation and parole inquiries and subsequent searches. And Lieutenant Montgomery, the last time we discussed the various court cases and issues and definitions of racial profiling, as well as a look at the new Oakland policy.
Okay.
Have you had access to the Oakland policy?
I got this packet this morning. It was dropped off for me. I got it this morning, and so I haven't really gone in depth
Okay.
on the Oakland draft policy.
So in sum, what it says is two things, basically. One is that the Oakland police shall not ask immediately of motorists and pedestrians if they're on probation or parole, although they can ask later respectfully. So there's two things, not immediately and respectfully.
And it's pending, you can do
It's
it right
pending.
there, if you want.
It was passed, I believe, by the police commission.
Hmm?
It was passed by the
By the
police.
commission, but
Yeah,
is it,
yeah.
is it,
I don't
do
believe
they
it's
have
passed
final
the council.
authority? Oh, no, the
No.
council would have final authority,
Right.
yeah.
And the second thing about it is that fourth waiver searches of people on probation and parole shall only occur when the offense had been nonviolent.
Say
So-
that one again?
The fourth waiver searches
fourth
are only
waiver.
allowed in Oakland, according to this new policy, if it passes council, if the offense for which they are on probation or parole is violent.
Right. Okay.
Violent.
So for nonviolent offenses, you cannot do a fourth waiver search in Oakland according to this, if it passes.
Okay.
Yeah, and
You do realize that that's inconsistent with case law,
yes.
Supreme Court case law?
Yes, well, Supreme Court, and I've written, so you, in this handout,
Yes, ma'am.
I go into the various court cases, and yes, it is absolutely allowable under Supreme Court law as well as California law to do those searches, but Oakland has chosen to, but that doesn't preclude a more restrictive.
Right, I just wanted to call it out because in the
Yeah.
case of federal probation, that is the case, that you need suspicion of a serious violent felony.
Yes,
In
yes.
the case of federal probation, but not in the case of state or county probation.
That's right, in California.
In California.
So federal law and the law of some other states, notably Pennsylvania and some other states, have more restrictive policies. And Oakland has chosen to start closing that door a little bit, even though, so California law allows it, for sure. Allows suspicionless searches of parolees and probationers.
Right.
The penal code allows it and court interpretations allow it. But that doesn't preclude different jurisdictions from restricting it.
But also I'd like to mention that people are searched who are not on probation and parole.
Yes, well,
So,
that requires, technically, and you can say that it's not happening, but that requires a level of suspicion
Or consent.
or consent, yeah. There's three types of searches: consent,
Right.
articulable facts of suspicion, or this fourth waiver. And so you're absolutely right that California law allows those, but jurisdictions can limit. You know.
Right.
So anyway, this subcommittee was for the purpose of looking at the Berkeley policy
Mhm.
to see whether we might want to do something in that direction. And I was motivated to look at these policies in part because of the various reports. Well, in part because I've seen complaints about it happening. When there is no suspicion, people feel disrespected. When they're asked, people of color feel disrespected. And secondly, I really feel urgently that we need to get to the bottom of some of these discrepancies in search statistics that show that African Americans are 4 times more likely to be searched when stopped, 6.5 times more likely to be stopped, 4 times more likely to be searched when stopped. And given that African Americans are complaining that they are the ones that are questioned about parole and probation, it makes sense to re-examine this policy. Now, I understand that the police department, as well as others, and I take this seriously, have argued that those statistics are not entirely reliable because of the fact that some of the people who are stopped probably don't live in Berkeley. So, you know, the population of Berkeley is used as the denominator in these things, and that may not be appropriate. Nonetheless, when you have a statistic that is 6.5 times, one has to worry, even if it's 4 times or 3 times.
So the authors of the report specifically cautioned against that, drawing those kind of conclusions. And they actually steered very clear of making conclusions about the exact meaning of that. They called it out as an issue and a concern. It's an
Yes.
issue and a concern for us
Yes.
as well. But the authors of the report would not come to the conclusion
No.
that that was racial profiling.
No, they would not, they would not. But they, at the same time, the authors were very clear that we should probe what is causing this. That we should examine what is causing this, including looking at these policies. As well as the PRC report from 2017 did the same, which City Council affirmed unanimously on consent. Therefore, that's what we're doing. And so, yes, I would not, but, yeah. So, this subcommittee, last time we met last week, was going to look carefully at the Oakland policy to see if there are parts of that that could make sense for Berkeley. And my assignment was to lay out a kind of narrative discussion of why we're proceeding in this way. And so what I did was I talked about the statistics. This handout talks about the statistics. It talks about the City Council and the mayor and the PRC over the years asking for these policies to be examined. Then a long paragraph on the various court cases. My recommendation, and this is not something that we have discussed as a group, but my recommendation that fourth waiver searches absent suspicion should perhaps be terminated. I know this is not something that you will agree with.
So a couple things. So looking at this, the case law around this is literally hundreds of cases.
I know.
The case law around this topic is literally hundreds of cases between case law and search and
Yeah.
seizure, probation and parole, car stops, arrest law, detention, literally hundreds of cases. And so I just got this assignment yesterday and was able to review a little bit. And so I went to one of our sources for that kind of advice on case law to share with you. So I don't know the rules about providing information to the subcommittee, like how it has to be sort of duly accepted or made public or whatever, but I did bring some information, the one copy for myself to refer to, and then the copier jammed on me, so I had to run out without bringing it. But I could provide you some more background information, because there's a lot of information, very relevant information that isn't covered here.
Right, I know, but these are the landmark cases that I discovered. I mean, I've read many articles on this subject, scholarly articles and law reviews and so forth, and these are the cases that are routinely cited as setting precedents of various kinds.
What information are you talking about?
One of our sources for information is the CCNI. It's it's a source book made by the Alameda County District Attorney's Office that highlights issues and then calls out the case law. So for example, on investigative detentions, they have a chapter in the source book which, cites literally hundreds of 148 case citations. The point I'm making isn't to say whether one case is more important than the other. The point I'm making is that it's an incredibly nuanced and complex area, and I really feel like this is the second meeting that, like in the spirit of kind of working together and listening to one another and giving voice to concerns, that we talk about that we really take the time and do a fact-finding phase before we get to the point where we're making conclusions about how we should change law enforcement or public safety. And so these are really serious and important issues all across the board, the ones being raised and the ones I hope to raise. And I think we ought to, in a spirit of like kind of listening to one another about how these things impact safety and how these things impact officer safety and how these things impact the community. I think we should really be in a fact-finding mode rather than a conclusion mode.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Agreed. I mean, we have had access to this is put out by the Alameda County District Attorney, and we've, studied some of these documents. This goes through some of that case law.
Those are the quarterly that they send out.
Yeah.
And they kind of touch on the high-level issues and big issues.
I guess what I want to say is the case law, whatever the case laws, I suspect that what we'll find is that the case law unilaterally gives the police the right to do this, to do parole inquiries and searches. I suspect that's the bottom line of what we'll find by looking at the details of all the case law, and I don't want to dispute that. My question is it not also possible for specific jurisdictions to then, that's the latitude of discretion that the police are given, but isn't it also possible, and we don't dispute that it's the right of police to do this. The question is whether specific jurisdictions, certainly certain states do this. Entire states, Pennsylvania and Vermont, other states don't allow these kinds of searches. In spite of the Supreme Court Sampson versus California, which gives state officers the right to do it. But
well, anyway, it seems pretty clear that the Berkeley police could amend their policies, right? Oakland's amending theirs. The question is, what's that look like?
the question is, what's the best practice to do?
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I mean,
That's what we
where
gotta
we're
get
at.
to.
I don't think we need to read all the cases, cause we know that you have the right to do it, there's no question about that.
Right, we got that.
No question. The
Yeah.
question is, what's the best practice to do two things? One is make sure that communities of color don't lose respect and trust for the police. And
That's
it
very
would
important.
seem to me that one not that difficult way to do that is not to disproportionately inquire of them if they're on parole, which for them is a sign of disrespect. I've been stopped for traffic offenses. Never in my life have I been asked this question.
Are you, where you,
I've been in California for 30 years.
no, what I mean was, how did you arrive at the conclusion that we're disproportionately asking the question?
Anecdotally, because there are no data that I know. Anecdotally, is that people, I sat at that Juneteenth booth the other day, and people came up to me over and over telling me, volunteering that this is something that really rankles. And so it's anecdotal, and maybe we need data on these fourth waiver searches.
I'm not dismissing anecdotal information, I just wonder
Do
if
you
it was.
know if we perhaps have that data?
We do not collect that data. So we do not collect data about the investigative questions that we ask on a stop. They're all still very unique, depending on the circumstances of that stop.
But you collect data on the searches, but not on the type of search,
That's
which
right,
are those
we've
three.
collected that data for years.
But
Mostly-
not whether it's consent or fourth waiver.
The reason why we collect that data is to explain the reason for the search. So in a case where somebody is a probationer or a parolee and that's the cause for the search, we collect that data, that's
So
part of
you
our
do have
stop.
that data,
Yeah, if that's the reason for the search.
right,
Yeah.
If what?
if that's the reason for the search.
If we conduct a search,
The
when we conduct a search, we give an indicator in our DISPO codes, why we searched. And one of the reasons is probation or parole search.
Oh, I see, yeah. Is that, can you aggregate that information, or?
That's the information that was provided to CPE. So,
Oh, it was.
and it's on our public data portal as well.
Mhm.
So in the DISPO code, one of the codes for search for probation or parole is there. Sometimes it's probation parole,
Mhm.
sometimes it's probable cause, sometimes it's incident to arrest.
Mhm.
But that's captured in the DISPO code for all of our detentions, car stops and vehicle stops.
Yeah.
See, my concern is that African Americans and Latinos, especially blacks, are more likely to be on parole or probation because they're the ones disproportionately who fill the prisons. I'm concerned that given that could be a reason why police officers are asking people of color, and that to me would be racial profiling.
Okay, so let me deconstruct that a little bit.
Okay,
Okay, so in the case of parole, that is directly reflective of people who have been to the prisons, as you say.
yes,
In the case of probation, these are alternatives many times to our incarceration, so people have made a plea deal,
Right.
consented
Right.
to searches,
Right.
and taken probation, and those people may not be part of a prison population. They have been arrested,
right,
but they may not have been to prison.
right. In either case, it's more likely to be a person of color than a white. Yeah, that's
yeah,
what the
what I'm saying, what I'm drawing the distinction is that this is, the issue of probation is not necessarily a question of prison population, a result of
No,
prison population.
no,
Parole,
no,
yes,
I
it is,
didn't mean to-
absolutely.
I didn't mean to say that.
I have a question. I wanna know, when did they start asking this question? Because I remember growing up in Berkeley, they were never asking people this. So when did this start?
I can't answer that. I know that
The
I was
years,
trained.
how long have you been?
I've been a police officer for 19 years.
Okay, so it's been going on
Yeah.
since you.
My entire career, there are reasons I'd love to get into about why we ask those questions and how it can change and enhance the safety of the officer. I'm really concerned about, I think it's a bad situation if somebody leaves an encounter with the police and they feel like they were just stopped because of
And that's how they're
anything.
feeling, and also, you have a tool of their identification to check through all your database.
Maybe.
To see if they're on probation or parole.
Perhaps.
So you really don't have to ask them that, and I personally feel, as an African American,
Yeah.
that this has been going on throughout the communities in Berkeley.
Yeah, so
So we
I'm,
need to, bring everyone to the table and let them know that this isn't racial profiling, even though it looks like it.
yeah, so
But
what,
it
so,
isn't.
so what I was, I'm with you, Ms. Allamby. What I was saying was, this is really important. I mean, and we should be doing things that undermine that sense that people have when they
Right.
leave and they say, I just got stopped because of this. And a lot of that would be bringing people to the table, talking about issues, hearing people out, figuring out how the relationship between police and communities work. That's really important work.
Yeah, and how it broke down.
Right.
Because it wasn't always like this, it wasn't a tension like it is now.
And it was inserted in the penal code in California in 1996, that this was permissible.
Right.
So,
And then this court cases tested it over
Mhm.
time until 2006, when Sampson versus
Right,
California
right.
said, fine. Clarence Thomas being
Right,
the
right.
principal author of that. But, so it was not until 1996 that the California Penal Code specifically allowed it. Prior to that, it was mostly for probation officers and parole officers to
Right.
supervise.
yeah, so what I would also like to talk about is the difference between how something is received and the sort of will with which it's given. So I can tell you that I personally asked that question many times, and I never meant to give offense. I never was making assumptions about somebody based on their color. That was never in my heart, and so I always felt like there were reasons why we do it that that the mechanics of a car stop, the mechanics of a detention, the process, and how can make a situation safer for the officer and the people being detained, that I'd like to talk about, because then it becomes a balancing act. Then it becomes a question of, is the imposition, how does it balance out against the needs?
But Lieutenant,
those needs.
so if the officer feels that this is a potentially unsafe situation and I need to ask this question, is it not true then that you're talking about there's some suspicion? In other words, why do we need this question and like Glenn says, it can be found in the records anyway, right? A record check.
Right.
But if the situation feels potentially threatening, that already says to me that there's a suspicion.
So the question, no, it could, yes, but it also could not. So in some situations, it's an assessment question on some levels. So it could be assessing, are we dealing with somebody who has been convicted of a crime?
Is what?
Has been convicted of a crime?
And what do you use to judge that?
So let me finish. So if I walk up to a car stop and I'm investigating, so first of all, every car stop is an investigation. Some car stops are an investigation of a vehicular crime. Every contact and every detention is, in essence, an investigation. You're trying to get to, you're trying to get somewhere. You're trying to get information. So one of the things we ask a lot of questions that are potentially offensive. For example, we will ask people if there's any guns in the car. If anybody felt that they were only being asked that because of their race, that would be an offensive question.
Is this on a traffic stop you're talking that's asked?
Absolutely, traffic
And
stop.
why would you ask that question? What would signal to you that you need to ask that question? I've certainly never been asked it.
Okay,
so what are the signals?
Okay, so let's backtrack then. Let's go back a little bit. So car stops are the most, domestic violence incidents and car stops are the most dangerous incidents, the most dangerous things that officers get involved in.
Yeah.
It's the most likely place that we're gonna be assaulted. It's the most likely place where we're gonna be killed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we ask a question about weapons, because people will tell us, yes, I have a weapon. Because then we take certain different precautions, okay? So what the questions, those questions about the criminal history, whether the person's armed or not, whether there's anything illegal in the car, they're not meant to be patently offensive to person. We don't target.
No, they're not. I'm just
But they
wondering.
would be offensive if we only asked them because somebody was African American, right? I mean, that would make it offensive. What I'm saying to you is that's not the reason we're asking.
So if two African Americans are driving down the road at midnight and they're stopped for a minor traffic offense, what would signal to the officer that they need to ask those people if they're on parole?
The officer is taking officer safety precautions. We'd say, is anybody in the car armed? Are there any weapons in the car? Is there anything illegal in the car?
Why would they ask that?
What do you mean?
Why would they ask that when somebody has failed to use a blinker at a turn?
Because these car stops are so dangerous.
I know, but the point is, white people are not asked that question.
I cannot agree with that.
Okay,
conclusion.
some white people are.
I just can't.
Terry and I are not.
Yeah,
Is it age?
I cannot
Okay.
sort of agree with that conclusion.
But what we suspect is that it's vastly disproportionately people of color.
So let's go through the mechanics of a car stop to see, and let's make this just completely raceless. Like there's no race. It's just any car stop,
Right.
any person.
But that's
any
not
age.
what we're dealing with. We're dealing with reality. People are being stopped.
I understand, but
People are being asked these questions. People are being searched. Their cars are being searched. A lot of them are not on probation or parole. So it's a problem.
So
But we're not doing that to the Caucasians in the city of
I
Berkeley.
can't agree with that conclusion.
Well,
So
I'm
I can't.
telling
I
you.
understand your feeling. I'm hearing you.
Yeah, it's what's going on. So we just wanna get to the point that maybe we can get some type of policy that will work with the police where they don't feel threatened or whatever you're saying, you're feeling. And like I'm saying to you, when you take my driver's license, you can check to see if I am on probation, if I'm on parole, if I killed somebody, or whatever I've done. So you don't have to ask me those questions.
However, Ms. Allamby, I understand where you're coming from. I understand the feeling and the intention, and I really appreciate it. The issue that I'm kind of feeling is that we're considering these stops from the perspective of what they call an innocent citizen. The officers, we conduct ourselves on car stops, and we conduct our safety not based on the assumption that everyone we meet is an innocent citizen. In order to stay safe, we conduct our car stops on the basis that some people will victimize officers, some people are committing crimes, and we conduct an investigation, a mini investigation, if you will, at that moment, to sort of get to the root of whether this person is, in fact, the innocent citizen who would, rightly feel, upset by these questions, or if the person is somebody with a gun in their pocket. So we have to conduct our car stops in a way that's safe for all of the stops, not just the nice and innocent people who've done nothing wrong and who would rightfully be offended by these kind of questions, but for the entire spectrum.
And my issue is when you approach a motorist, it's a potentially dangerous situation, I get that. You need to quickly evaluate the situation. And I want to hear from you, what criteria enter into that evaluation if it has nothing to do with race?
So the reason why and this is well-litigated case law, and I think we kind of established, is that there need not be probable cause or a reasonable suspicion of the person in a crime to ask these questions.
No, but I want to know how you evaluate if this is dangerous and therefore I need to ask these questions.
So we start a car stop with officer safety practices in place that presume from the outset that this is a dangerous situation. A car stop in and of itself is the baseline. No matter who we stop,
Mm-hmm.
it's a potentially dangerous situation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's not, it is statistically proven that it is the most dangerous place. It's one of the most dangerous places police encounter and where we are most likely to be killed or assaulted.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's not, so when we approach a stop, we have tactics, and some of those tactics involve questions that help us navigate the investigation in an expeditious manner. So as to the question of, well, why don't you just run my driver's license? That's a great question, because in more cases than you imagine, people don't provide driver's licenses. In more cases you imagine, people just tell you their name. And then there's an investigation to establish either they've given you the right name or if they're not giving you the right name. So they don't always give us a license. Okay, another reason, and this is another reason to ask that question, probation and parole, relatively early, is because it's a fork in the road in your car stop. So when I come up to the car, if I establish early that I am going to need to serve a probation search, I establish that early, then I take different tactics through the rest of the stop because I'm going to be conducting the search of the vehicle and the probationer. So knowing that early, the sooner you know that, you begin implementing different measures to continue to make that car stop safe. So the sooner I know it, for example, I might not leave the car. If somebody tells me they're on probation or parole and I ask that question, I'm probably not gonna leave the car. I'm gonna stay right there at that car until my cover comes, because I know I'm gonna be conducting a search. The reason why I don't leave the car is because, unfortunately, not the nice innocent people, that we all can empathize with, but criminals will use the time when you leave the car to hide and secrete weapons, to load weapons, to prepare to ambush officers, as we've seen locally right here in Oakland. So
how many times has this happened in Berkeley?
how many times?
We're dealing with Berkeley right now. Oakland's over there. How many times in Berkeley have you stopped African Americans, Latinos, or others of color where they've, decided to ambush you or anything like that? Something realistic.
So we have an officer.
Because I've never heard of it, but I'd like to hear
Okay.
it if it's happened.
Sure. So there's an officer here who made a car stop on a parolee. Okay. When he made this stop, the information was that the parolee said he's never going back to prison. He's going to shoot it out.
You said, you know what?
He's never going to go back to prison.
So let me stop. So this officer asked the man if he's on parole?
As soon as he made the car stop,
He asked him.
the officer, or the subject got out of the car and started fighting, the subject ran, and eventually he shot the officer through his badge and in the heart.
Okay, so
Okay,
the
so-
officer didn't have a chance to ask him if he was on probation or parole, or he had to ask
He
him?
was a known parolee when he was conducting this stop.
Okay,
My point is that it's very easy to think about the sort of broad spectrum of nice and innocent interactions that we're gonna have. And to forget the inherent danger and that certain protocols have to be in place to make these things safe. And that's not only for the officer safety is important, but it also, taking control of a situation can make it safer for the people in the vehicle.
I guess I don't understand why asking that question. If this man, I assume it's usually a man, is out to hurt the officer, I don't understand why asking him that question is going to cause him not to pull his gun or ambush the officer. I would think it would be even more likely if you ask that question.
I'll give you another one.
That they be,
I was on a car stop. I pull up to the window. I asked the guy if he's on probation or parole, but as I approach the window, I see him hand something to his passenger occupant. She puts it behind her purse and puts it down on the floorboard, okay? I asked the guy right away, are you on probation or parole? Fork in the road,
Mhm.
okay? Now I know whether I'm gonna be searching the car or not searching the car, whether I have cause to search the car or not, because I have a safety concern, a serious safety concern.
wait, but you saw this action.
I saw something being handed to
But what was the purpose of stopping him in the first place?
blacked out windows. So in this case, I asked the guy, are you on probation or parole? And he told me, yeah, he was on probation or parole. So imagine the fork in the road, the safety fork in the road. If I had just said to him, how you doing, sir? Can I see your driver's license? I'm gonna go back to my car, run a records check. The woman would have been allowed to sit with that gun
But
until I
you saw him
returned.
pass it to her.
I saw him pass something to her.
Okay.
It
and
turned out to be a gun.
Could you ask
I
to
could-
see what's,
I
it
couldn't
seems to me you have suspicion there.
I couldn't articulate that I saw a gun. I just saw him hand her something and her put her purse below the chair.
But you suspected it was,
Immediately my concerns went up. So I asked, I said, are you on probation or parole? He said, yeah, I'm on parole.
Mhm.
Okay. So instead of going back to my car as proposed, running on a records check, I immediately converted the stop into a parole search, okay? Which immediately took control of the situation. Because remember when I talk about converting a situation to a parole or probation search, it means I'm gonna take countermeasures, I'm gonna remove people, I might be handcuffing people for safety, I might be getting extra additional officers there. The sooner I can take those safety precautions, the better. So in that case, he had passed a gun to the passenger, and the passenger hit it behind her
but you
purse.
say, it seems to me in that case you had suspicion.
When I saw something being passed, I was already switching gears in my mind. However, I did not know or have cause at that point to search that car based on what I saw.
But you stopped the car because you're stating they had windows, tinted windows, is that
So
what
it
you're
was
saying?
speeding up Ashby, blacked out windows, I saw it, it turned a corner. There were a lot of factors leading into this stop. When it turned the corner, a reaction to police presence, it was like a whole bunch of things leading up to the stop. When I made the stop, I went up to the car, I saw this thing being passed across. The point is that there is the point I'm trying to make is that when you ask that question, the answer could imply that you're gonna be able to go back to your car and run somebody out, and it could imply that that you're gonna be going into a different vein, into a searching the vehicle vein, which is a
So
safety
then,
vein.
did you wait for backup before you searched?
In that case, I had my cover with me. Yeah,
You had what?
in that case, I had a
He had
partner
his
with me.
cover
I had
with
a
him.
partner with me that day.
Oh, okay.
And so why wouldn't it have been possible to go back to what Commissioner Allamby is saying? Why wouldn't it have been possible, since you had your cover with you, or since you were going to wait for a cover if you didn't have them with you, because you had this suspicion, to go and check the records,
Because every minute we leave somebody in the car.
even though you had your cover there with them?
Yeah, so the cover there helps, but when we're dealing with us, and again, this is the sort of
So I guess
perspective of how an innocent person would feel about all these things.
I
In
guess
this
I
case, he
don't
had a gun.
understand, I guess I don't understand how other states pull this off. Other states don't allow this. Many other states don't allow these, fourth waiver searches, and so.
So I'm not aware of those states. I mean, I'm trained here in California.
Yeah, Pennsylvania doesn't have them, they're dealing with Philadelphia, it's a big
So-
crime city, so I guess.
So what I'm saying to you is not that, I'm not making the case that this is required. I'm trying to help you understand how it affords safety
I
during the
understand,
stop.
I understand, and,
Yeah.
and you know, every time we on the PRC do something of this sort, and Spivhoods is coming up, you know, next week, I wrestle with balancing tests.
We
And
should-
what we have to balance is interest in the safety and security of the officer and others on the scene, and the consequences in terms of legitimacy, procedural justice issues involving respect. I want to really make sure that we're following best practices of procedural justice and are not disrespecting folks.
I agree.
And so my concern, because we know anecdotally, I don't know anybody in the white community who's saying, darn, they keep on asking me if I'm on parole. It's in the black community all the time. It's hard to imagine that these anecdotes are both based on false experiences or false information. And so, you know, I'm trying, by asking these questions of you, I'm trying to understand exactly, I mean, I think I see in that situation that asking that question helps you, you know, launch the search quicker than not.
And
but-
take season that control.
But I wanna figure out a policy that can do both, you know, and so I'm more aligned with, you know, using the record, you know, waiting for backup if you have, in that case, it seems like you could almost do a suspicion, a search based on suspicious activity.
I can tell you in that moment, I did not feel like I had the car.
Okay, well, that's good, I'm glad you're, have a high
You
threshold for that.
didn't feel like you had
I didn't feel like
articulable.
I didn't feel like I had the car. I didn't feel like I had the right and authority to begin the search. But when I asked the question, probation or parole, he said, "Yeah, I'm on probation for parole." That changed things.
So how can we have a policy that doesn't, see, you know, and I am convinced that there's not more racial profiling in the police department than there is anywhere in society. And so when I ask you the question, how do you make that judgment so quickly, whether this is a potentially dangerous situation? You would be superhuman if race didn't enter into that.
So what I'm telling
Because
you,
it enters into everybody else's judgments.
so what I'm saying to you is, you're saying, how do you make that conclusion? And I'm saying we start car stops with that assumption.
I know, but
Every
then
car
you
stop is
filter
dangerous.
some people out, and the people you're filtering out, I suspect, disproportionately, are the middle-aged white people. It's hard to imagine otherwise, because that's in the collective consciousness. And so, you know, it is not legal to make these judgments in whole or in part based on race. How can it be avoided?
So
Given that race permeates our culture, given that race is definitive in terms of the prison and probation population, not definitive, but disproportionately affects people of color. How could it not be that that would enter into your judgment about who or what is dangerous? Because it would enter into mine, to be honest. So how do we do this?
I'm not arguing that. Everyone's experiences and their biases that they bring to the table affect how they make decisions, how they make judgments. And we work hard to train officers to be aware of where their biases could come from and when they may be sort of challenged by their own beliefs. And we challenge our officers' beliefs because we believe as a department that we should not be involved in stopping someone based on who they are, what color they are, any of that stuff. I would, and I would submit to you that the investigative questions that we ask also help us refine our understanding of who the person is that we're dealing with. If they have a warrant, if they are on probation or parole, if they have consented to parole or probation searches, that part part of the process of asking questions is that refining our understanding of the person we're dealing with, right? So, and in light of all of our, we're all human, right? If somebody has consented to probation searches, for example, when the officer stops them, we wanna know that early, because that refines our understanding of who we may be dealing with. And I'll tell you, many people on probation are also not gonna do any harm to officers, and are also, good people trying to make their lives better. And the probation process and the probation search process, the intent of it is to make sure somebody stays on track, on the rehabilitative track, to not continue to commit crimes. That's the
So
purpose.
part of what the literature says about the rehabilitative track and so forth is that these questions actually are seen to interfere with reintegration into the community, because they underscore the parolee or the probationer's status as marginal and not quite full rights-bearing citizens. And so there is some concern, in addition to the procedural justice concern, there is some concern that it in fact hinders a full reintegration. But, we've been spending all this time on the inquiry, but what about the search aspect of it? Suppose somebody is on probation and parole, but there's zero indication of any kind of criminal activity or suspicion on your part. Is it really necessary to do a search?
So it's hard to say, like, for example, I wouldn't say we always do a search. Sometimes we know our probationers. We've made stops before. We're familiar with them, for example. Sometimes you make a stop on somebody and they're on probation, and you, from prior interactions where you caught them doing something wrong, you know how they behaved.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you stop them today, they don't have any of those kind of emotional indicators, or not, they seem, and you may choose, all right, you know what, today, we're not gonna start a probation search because you're not giving me any indicators that you gave me last time when you were caught committing a crime.
So would there be any problem from your perspective with not doing fourth waiver searches absent suspicion of any sort?
Oh, there'd be a tremendous problem with that, yeah.
Why?
Because, a couple things. So, go to Berkeley side, plug in the word probation, and look at all the articles that'll come up just over the last couple of years of instances where an officer, and when you're saying suspicion, you're saying like, I hope you're talking about reasonable suspicion, like a reasonable suspicion.
Articulable facts, yeah.
Right, okay, so not just, hunch or something like that, something greater than that.
Yeah.
In the case of a probation or parole search, when you ask those things, and somebody says, I'm on parole for guns, see how that's different than I'm on parole for writing bad checks? I'm on probation for writing bad checks. So the information and how it comes back to us changes our assessment. So the answer can in and of itself be like, oh, I need to search this. If the answer is, yeah, I'm on probation for running guns, then all of a sudden, if they weren't already, alarm bells are gonna be going off for the officer, like, oh, this might be.
And they would offer that information, or you would ask them why
We
they're on?
ask them why, yeah. So
Why they're on?
there's follow-on questions, well, what for? It is a tool that allows us to handle the stop safely. And if you said you can't ask, then those officers who didn't have any indicators, because every time somebody's shot, a lot of times officers are shot, there may have been no indicators, may have been acting in a way that question could have made their stop significantly more safe. So
What happens if
we're
they lie to you?
requiring it.
What happens if they lie to you and say they're not on parole probation?
So that could be a violation of the conditions of their parole or probation.
I see.
Yeah.
So that would be their incentive not to.
Right.
They know that they could go back.
They know, if somebody knows you're going to find out,
Yeah.
then they're not likely to lie to you. In practice, in reality, when somebody is on probation or parole, I find very, very infrequently, with the exception of maybe somebody who has a parole warrant, like for an absconding warrant, that mostly people will say, yeah, I'm on probation or parole.
kind of in
I don't
your
find
sense-
people lying to me about that.
In your sense about being on the street and stops, you've done a lot of stops over time. What would be your ballpark figure about how many stops you've made and people are actually on parole or probation? I mean, would it be like 10%, 20%, 30%?
So bear in mind that the place I'm at in my career, I'm not making stops all the time anymore. It's not my,
Right,
it's not
I
my
understand
assignment.
that.
I'd say when I was actively making stops, it's hard for me to ballpark. It was fairly common, but I worked in the narcotics unit. I was on a street team. So in those cases, the work we were doing was around probation or parolees quite a bit. So it's hard for me to ballpark. It's fairly common that people answer yes, I'm on probation or parole.
I mean, give us, what would fairly common be in your?
It's hard to come up with a number. It's maybe 25-30%.
25 or 30%.
Of people who are stopped for minor traffic offenses?
And maybe I'm ballparking. Yeah. So
You're just trying to give us a sense.
I'm giving you an idea. I'd say about a quarter
I'm just
of the
trying to
time
understand
somebody
if
in the
it's-
vehicle might be on
This is
probation.
1 in 10 people or
Yeah.
8 in 10 people or something, you know?
Yeah. So
Well,
because here's the issue. If a person committed a crime, pled to the crime, got put on probation, that shows us maybe that person wasn't respecting the laws like you and I would respect them, and then sort of downstream they may also be doing driving behaviors that don't respect the law, and somewhere downstream they might be getting into situations that don't. The behavior, the issue is trying to rehabilitate the behavior that's not outside of the law. And so when we're investigating these things, like somebody breaking a law, it might be a law that you and I would never break, right? So so maybe that's why they seem to be overrepresented in the stops, is that somebody on some level may be a bit of a scofflaw. May not stop at stop signs because they didn't care about carrying guns, and they don't care about selling drugs, and they don't care about this, that, and the other, and they also don't care about stop signs. So they run into us more often. Maybe is the reason for an overrepresentation, but I'm really hesitant. I'm just spitballing here with that number. I can't.
Can I ask you a question about, this is.
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Yeah, I'm
too.
sorry, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay, so, what are your training practices? In other words, how do you train people around this issue? Are you saying, hey, every stop's you treat it like it could be a criminal situation, and so you ask these questions, or how does that go down?
The way we train officers is to start with the presumption that it's dangerous, and that this is a situation we need to control, right? That we are gonna take certain measures to exercise control over the person in the car. Okay? We're gonna ask them, if we can't see their hands, to show us their hands. We're gonna ask them not to root around in the center console. We're going to ask them to turn the car off so they don't put it in drive and flee. That we're going to turn on our lights so that we can see inside the car. We're starting from a presumption that this is a dangerous situation we need to seize control of. Okay? We ask, when we're doing an investigation, we're starting with the presumption that the person's giving information, that we're going to confirm that information. That we're going to, somebody tells me their name, I'm not gonna take it for granted that that's their name. I'm gonna go through a process of asking them, well, have you ever been arrested? The reason why I ask that question is because if you have, I may have a photo of you if you don't have a driver's license and one on file with the state. So I ask you a series of questions that this process is doing a couple things. It's allowing me to gauge your honesty, your cooperation. Your regular, natural, innocent citizen is cooperating, they've got their paperwork ready, that's not what we're talking about. I mean, those are the people that are likely to be offended, because they're gonna say, look, I have all my paperwork, you're asking me these questions, why do you think I'm a criminal, right?
So the training does really include that kind of question.
Yeah, and it emphasizes also, we ask people if they've ever been arrested before, we ask people if they're on probation or parole. And we train that of our new officers.
Yeah.
Now,
I say, one of the officers in one of the hearings I was in said, well, because it was an issue about this, and he said, well, I asked that of everyone, and you know, it didn't make sense to me because I've been stopped in Berkeley before they didn't ask me.
Okay.
And,
So I
you know,
would-
it's been a few years, but.
So that's a personal prerogative of the officer to say
Yeah.
whether they, I always do this and that's their practice, or whether they, the truth is that for me, you develop a sort of, broad base of experience,
Right.
dealing with, like, for example, I know a lot of the probation police when I was doing narcotics work.
Right, right.
So, that experience serves you. A brand new officer is bereft of that experience. So that question serves him more than it would serve somebody who had a good idea who the probation or the police were.
Right,
Does that
but
make
it would
sense?
seem like if that was the case and they're being trained to do that, and most people are doing
Right.
that, it would be kind of insultive to anyone, right? And so-
I
I
wouldn't
mean, I
say
understand.
that, I wouldn't say that.
Well, but I understand, the dilemma you're in. I mean, I, you know, after we had our meeting last time, I was thinking more about this thing about running the records.
Mhm.
And then I was thinking, well, gee, to run the records, he's gotta go back to his car. And if he's gotta go back to his car, what if there is a problem in the car? So, you know, I see where it could be really a safety problem. And, you know, Oakland, I noticed, didn't ban it. Basically, they said you ask at a more appropriate point when you found out more information, I think it is the idea, I think. Let me just ask you on the records check, what happens, let's get back to this driver's license thing and so forth. What happens if someone doesn't have a driver's license? How do you handle that on a stop? You ask for an ID and they don't have one.
So we're gonna start from the presumption that I need to prove that they are who they say they are.
Yeah.
So what I do is, I'll ask for their date of birth, I'll ask them how old they are, because people who give fake date of birth often can't calculate the age. So I'm kinda doing a little cross-checking investigation, okay? It's,
What are you trying to determine?
what I'm trying to determine is if they're likely the person. I may stay at the vehicle instead of going back to my vehicle
Mhm.
and use the radio instead of using my car, because we train officers not to sit in the vehicle and run things out, because officers get ambushed sitting in their vehicle looking at
Right.
computer screens instead of looking at the people who may mean to do harm to them.
Can you check the record right from your radio while you're standing there at the car?
You can, but
You can.
here's the trick.
What?
You're radioing into a radio channel.
Yeah.
The dispatcher has a line of people potentially waiting for a records check run.
Mm.
So you may be waiting for the dispatcher to run your record. Sometimes they just pick right up and run it, and they get you your answer really quickly.
Mhm.
And sometimes you're third in line, and you might be standing at the car waiting for 5 or 10 minutes. Now, if I ask the person, instead of waiting there for 5 to 10 minutes, are you on probation or parole, then my stop changes directions into taking precautions for safety around the fact that I'm gonna need to remove the people from the car and conduct a search. See what I'm saying?
How often, do you generally ride in pairs?
No, generally we do not. At the time that stop, I was assigned to the drug task force, and the drug task force at that time, when we had a drug task force, did ride in partners.
And can you find on a record check if it's what the person then was, if they were on probation or parole, can you figure out what it is?
That comes automatically when we
Well,
put
is
their
it like a
name in the
felony or a
system?
gun offense or something like that,
Yeah.
that would come back?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the issue, the safety issue that I'm trying to call out is the delay in making a decision about what kind of precautions we're
Right.
gonna take on this stop.
Understand.
Now, I really, the other thing we do training wise that I wanted to point out, that you brought training, was that we train officers, hey, look, you need to be conscious and say, hey, look, no offense, I ask this all the time, are you on probation or parole? We're conscious of the fact that.
But you're not asking it of Caucasians. And
Okay,
you-
I can-
and you keep telling us this, and you're not. I mean,
Okay,
it's
so
a known
I can't-
fact, you're not doing that.
There may be
So,
exceptions, there may be,
I
it
don't
may be
think so.
that some, well, you know,
I
if it's a
don't.
young man, a young white guy who's 25 years old and full of tattoos and, speeding down the road, and, I can imagine situations where some white people are asked that question. but I bet it's the,
I can't,
okay.
So.
I can't, my imagination does not extend that far.
Okay. So that's really important. So
Mhm.
that is the crux of what we ought to be talking about, is the feeling, the
It's
certain,
not a feeling,
no,
it's a fact.
the certainty that you have
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. Mhm.
That is where there's like a relationship to grow and build, and that is the heart of the issue, is that that people feel that way. Now I can tell you from knowing my own heart that I've never done police work that way, and I've asked that question many times, and I've asked people of all colors, and I can just tell you that. And you may not believe me. That's what we gotta work on, is the relationship where somebody leaves a situation feeling as though something was just done to them only because of fill in the blank.
Mhm.
That's the core of this.
Mhm.
That's the procedures and the practices and the safety that
So
are
how do we-
important, but that's really important.
How can we write a policy, not we, but collectively, how can a policy be written such that the result is not that people of color are or feel they are discriminated against? The policy that we currently, the policy that we currently have leaves people with that certainty, and that needs to be fixed. So I understand why you're pushing back against fixing it, but something needs to be done to fix it. And so what is the answer?
Okay, so I don't want you to misunderstand me. I feel like we're in a fact-finding phase.
Yeah.
I'm telling you why, from an officer's perspective, we do these things.
Right.
What Ms. Allamby is talking about is super important, that somebody is left with a feeling is super important. Super important. It's important to us, right? And that it could impact the relationship with the community, that it could impact a sense of legitimacy and safety.
And your own safety.
Right, and so
Yeah.
so I'm really trying to give voice to that. What I'm saying is, I'm not at the point where when I'm telling you about policing, and I'm telling you about police safety, I'm not talking in absolutes. I'm not saying we have to do this and we have to do it this way and that there's no other way.
Mhm.
I just really want it to be understood that how we got here today, like you're telling me how we got here today, but as an officer, I'm telling you the things that might not be visible from somebody who's well-intended and really wants there to be really good police relationships between communities and police. And so we want those good relationships too. But there are some things about police practice or what's going on in the mind of an officer that I think some conclusions are being made that I have a hard time. I want to challenge the conclusion, and I don't want to challenge the feeling. Okay, so let me tell you a story that I learned something in my life that I think is really helped me the way I look at this. Is like one day I was going to go help my grandfather mow a field, right? And so I borrowed a truck, not my truck, and I picked up this big mower deal that would mow weeds. And I went to the gas station I got gas for, and I'm going down the freeway, and it's Sunday morning, and there's nobody on the road. I'm just on the freeway, and I'm going, right around the speed limit, and some car comes flying up behind me, and they're flashing their lights, and they're honking their horn, and I'm like, what? Go around, like, why are you doing this? Like, what's your problem? Your problem with me is I'm going too slow in the fast lane? The freeway's wide open. Go around. Just go around. You know what I mean? And then the person pulled up next to me, and they pointed at me, and they glared at me, and they seemed to be yelling at me, but my window was up, and I'm like, I haven't even had my coffee yet, ma'am. Right? And honking and pointing and honking and pointing, and I'm like, you really want me to get over this bad that you're really willing to cause all this problem on the freeway? Like, get out of here. And I lost my cool. I got upset. I'll be honest, I got upset. And I gestured to the lady.
Okay.
I gestured, okay? I was really upset. Right? I knew what she was about. She wanted me to get out of her way. I was in the fast lane going too slow for her, and she wanted to get out of the way. My heart was pounding, it was pumping. So I pulled into my grandfather's lot, and I went to unload the equipment. My heart was still pounding, okay? And you know what?
She was trying to tell you that something was open, or?
The gas tank that I filled up was sitting on top of the
Yeah.
toolbox, and she was afraid it was gonna fall off on the freeway.
Right.
And she was trying to tell me.
Yeah.
And I just knew what was in her mind, and I just knew what was in her heart, and I just knew. I knew what she was experiencing, I knew what she was doing to me,
Yeah.
and I just knew.
Sure.
And so, when I think about the gas can, she was trying to help me.
Yeah,
She was trying to
right.
keep, and so like I look at this situation, I'm like, sometimes what we just know, or we just intuit, or we just feel with every bone in our body, is not exactly what's going on. And so like I can tell you from my experience, when I stop people, I was not trying to make a stop based on somebody's race.
No, and
I was trying-
nobody
But-
is suggesting that you or anyone else in the police department is doing that.
But somebody might
But there are
leave with that feeling.
There
that's
are
important.
collective stereotypes in our society that people internalize and don't act on consciously, but act on anyway.
You bet.
And I do it,
Right.
and everyone does it.
So what I'm trying to do is give you, instead of
And so
making
you're
a choice
trying
about
to-
what we're motivated by, what we're thinking, I'm trying to give some insight into what we're
Right.
thinking on these
Mhm.
stops and how we conduct them.
Terry, did you have more stuff you wanted to ask?
Well, I'm just thinking, that, I was wondering why Oakland wrote theirs the way they did, and probably they went through this same discussion.
Which part of it?
Oakland said, it says, to that end, officers shall not immediately inquire whether the individual is on supervised release unless there's an immediate threat to the officer, blah, blah, blah. So, rather than just say, you can't ask this, but it goes on to say, well, you would ask it in a respectful manner at a later point, possibly. That was kind of their deal. So, I can see where they were kind of grappling with this. It's like, well, is it appropriate to ask in some cases?
Mm-hmm.
And if it is, when do you ask and why do you ask,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not sure on, for me, it's like, it would be, under certain circumstances, it would be reasonable to ask. Gwen, let me ask you this on yours. If, do you think it's reasonable to ask under certain
No, I
circumstances
don't.
at all?
I don't. You
Yeah.
have the driver's license, you can
Yeah.
look on, and just like he says, some of the people he might know, he might not know,
Yeah,
but he has tools he can use. What's your date of birth? They can't figure it out, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to ask that.
mm-hmm,
You can check through your database,
yeah,
and you will know if they are or if they aren't.
mm-hmm,
And if you're not doing it to the whole population, then you should not single out
yeah,
the other
mm-hmm,
population. I don't think it's appropriate.
yeah,
And I don't think it's bridging gaps in Berkeley. We're so far apart. And this is not how I grew up
yeah,
here in Berkeley. We didn't have this problem.
mm-hmm,
And we have it now, and it's just prevalent over the city. I'm always hearing black males being stopped. A matter of fact, there was a young man and a lady in a car that got stopped recently. Matter of fact, about 2 weeks ago when I was coming home from the grocery store, and the police stopped them. I don't know why they stopped them, but I kind of watched to see what was going on. They searched their car, nothing there, and the police did like this. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm bad. What is that? That is not even professional. I was just like blown away. I couldn't believe it.
mm-hmm,
What was the purpose?
mm-hmm,
And then they just went on about their merry way.
Mm-hmm.
And the two people that were stopped were just standing there, and they were young. They were just standing there like in total disbelief, as I was.
mm-hmm, yeah,
But what was the initial purpose? I don't know what the purpose was, to
Right.
stop them. But they searched their car, and there was nothing in their car, and then he goes like this.
mm-hmm,
The other thing to segue on that is, and I don't have the data
I mean,
in
it was
front of
like
me.
apologizing, but really? After you go through all that, oh, I'm bad.
Apparently, the yield rate when whites are searched is higher than when people of color are searched. And that, and I don't know what the statistic is, it's in the CPE report.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But that signals to me that there is some racial profiling going on of the sort that either whites to get a search have to elicit there has to be greater suspicion, the threshold must be higher? Why is it that the yield is greater for whites who are searched?
So the CPE report called out those questions, but the CPE report stopped short of making the conclusions you're making that this has to be. In
I
fact,
didn't say it has to be, I said it certainly it raises questions about whether race is entering into the decision to stop, because given that you have a much higher number of blacks who are stopped than whites, and given that you find more stuff with the white searches, and given that there are collective stereotypes that a person would have to be superhuman to resist, put together says to me that race is entering in here, and I don't see how we can deny it. Which isn't to say that you have it in your heart. I mean,
we all know there are biases.
Yeah.
The question is, everybody has their biases.
The question
And
is
so
whether-
the question is, well, how do we fashion something
Exactly.
that will, not try to reinvent the wheel on
Right.
everybody's biases at this point,
Right.
but
But
to
the
be
will-
respectful about how we enforce in Berkeley and be respectful of the people of color community who really feel like they're suffering over this.
So the reason why I push back on that is because the CPE people are sort of drawing from that report and talking about that report, because let's talk about it, right? Because it's important, it's super important. But they also said that we have the lowest disparity of any agency they've ever measured.
Yeah, that's good.
That's good, right? So, and disparity in like law enforcement outcomes has to do with not just the police. We own a part of disparities. Society owns a part of it. Employment owns a part of it. The rest of the judicial system owns a part. It's a big picture, right? And so I guess the reason why I'm saying that is because when we sent this off to the statisticians, they said, "Hold on, time out. These are conclusions we cannot draw," and they're the scientists who specialize in the analysis. And so, but that's not where I think the real important work is, because just knowing the shortcomings of what's been written already, what they've done, try to figure out how to quantify a feeling that somebody has. The work is in addressing the relationship between the communities, is the really important work, if that makes sense. So why somebody, two different people are gonna look at that report in two different ways based on their own experiences, based on their own life and their own knowledge, right? And like I look at that report differently based on what I know and how I enforce and how I lead and how I see my officers working, subordinates working. So I am informed by that, and somebody else with a different part of the issue is informed differently about that. That's the crux of the work is the relationship and how we see things differently and how we can get closer together about how we see things.
To me, the important matter for us is how to construct policies. Given that we all understand that everyone shares implicit biases, that's just indisputable. How do we construct policies that limit the ability to behave in ways that are consistent with the biases, even when we're not intending to, right? In other words,
how do we
given that we
build
have
something that will keep officers safe and that will respect the needs of the community?
When you say respect, I'm concerned because procedural justice says you need to be polite and so forth. The Oakland policy for me doesn't go far enough, because it's not enough to ask a question but be polite when you ask it, because the disrespect comes in the question itself, not whether you say sir and ma'am,
Right.
So
It's an assumption.
I think that Berkeley
everyone
Police,
you stop is on probation or parole. I'm not on probation or parole.
in my limited
But
experience.
I'm just saying, if you look at me and I'm a person of color, are you gonna ask me that? I mean, really?
So you said earlier that we should be asking everyone. We should
If
ask
you're gonna
across the
do
board,
it, you
yeah.
should do it across the board. If not, rely on the identification. You have the system to check it out if they're on probation or parole. Otherwise, I don't see any purpose of asking that question.
So if I said to you, no offense, I ask this all the time,
Mhm.
that would be still offensive, right? You'd say that was offensive, but what if
Absolutely,
I said?
because I don't know if that's true.
What if I said, I'm asking this question because my policy says to do it, we do it across the board, that would not be offensive, or would that be?
That would bother me because I would have to see your policy, and I don't know anyone that you've done this to. I mean, really.
I understand, you're just experiencing the stop in that moment.
Yeah,
But
I don't know anyone.
if our
that
policy were, we ask everyone, would that change things for you?
No, because you're not going to ask everyone, just like you say, everyone has bias. And you're not going to, you're gonna continue to ask a certain segment of the population because your statistics is telling you that, you know, these are the people that are in the prison industry, so they're obviously criminals, so let's keep asking them. And maybe, you know, something might stick. Maybe we might find something in their car or whatever the motive, I don't know. But I just think we need to get away from that policy. We need to bring everyone together because there's people that are on the outside that's not real happy about this, and I'm one of them. And I grew up here and it wasn't like this. Now it is, but it's not being applied across the board. It's a certain segment that this is happening to and it's just not appropriate.
So.
Because you have another tool. If you didn't have the tool to call on your radio to see, then I would say, okay, well,
No,
ask.
yeah.
Yeah.
We talked about it's easy to look at a car stop as a series of steps that are gonna be taken. And in reality, it's the timing of those steps and the control of the timing of those steps that creates safety opportunities. So, for example, if a quarterback's down on the field and he throws the ball to the corner and the wide receiver is supposed to be at that corner at that moment and catch it, right? So when we find and he's not there because the timing was off, the catch was never made. In the case of our car stops, the sooner we know we're gonna be conducting a search of the vehicle, the more likely we're going to be able to prevent violence, the more likely we're going to be able to recover contraband, the more likely we'll be able to maintain control of the occupants. And going back to the car and running somebody out or using the radio and waiting in line for a dispatcher affects and changes the timing in a way that could impact safety.
But also, when you're getting ready to make a car stop, you've already looked at the license plate and you've already called it in. You should have. I mean, most of the time you're looking at the license and you're calling it in, so you're already gonna have that information before you even stop the vehicle.
Maybe, but again, we're thinking from the perspective of the innocent, law-abiding citizen. We stop cars without license plates. We stop cars with switched license plates. We stop cars without being able to sometimes we try to put the information out. So our protocol is we pull in behind a car, we get the license plate, the dispatchers tell us what they know about the car, whether it's registered, et cetera, whether there's warrants on the car. So we do those things in many car stops. But our protocols are set up to handle the worst scenarios, to prepare a safe situation for the entire spectrum of car stops, not just the well-intentioned law-abiding citizen who is going to have their little portfolio ready with their license and insurance and so on and so forth. A lot of our enforcement involves people who don't have driver's licenses, who do not have license plates on their car, who so it's a whole gamut, and our protocols about safety address the whole gamut, not just good people who are doing it right.
Do you run the plates before you actually go over to and talk to the person?
Yeah, typically we're able to call in and have dispatch run the
See if
plates.
there's anything funny about it.
So the first thing they do is, the first thing they check in is, you said that was a 2012 Honda, and I have that it's a Ford. So the
Right.
first thing they check in is does that plate seem to belong in that car?
Right.
And then there might get information back that says that there's a warrant on the car, or that the car's not registered, confirming maybe a reason for the stop. Maybe we saw there was no sticker on it. So we do put that information out. I would tell you also though, that is not all stops. In fact, the more serious the enforcement, the less likely you're gonna have time to broadcast the plate. So the more serious and more dangerous situations, the less likely you're gonna be able to get on the radio real quick. And those stops can tend to be more abrupt. They can tend to be less time to make some of the changes.
Mhm.
So that if, especially, for example, if somebody were sort of flagrantly driving down the road, screaming down the road, we might get up to the car and then they pull the curb, causing the situation to be more abrupt, and we just have to jump out of the car and confront the situation, start taking control of the safety of the situation, and might not get that license plate out.
Right.
On your standard run-of-the-mill car stop, we put out the plate before we pull it over.
Yeah.
And you can learn from that whether the owner of the car has a warrant out, and also whether they're on parole or not.
If, in some instances, when the warrant was issued, they also had the information to put the warrant on that car. But not every warrant do we know every car somebody's gonna be in. And of course, there's the issue of occupants. So it will only tell us about the registered owner. It won't tell us about the person who borrowed the car or all of the occupants of the vehicle. So
So if there's a warrant out, are you allowed to search the car?
Depends.
Okay.
The answer is depends.
So time is getting sort of late,
Mhm.
and I think that the
Yeah.
committee
Yeah.
should,
Mhm.
decide what we do next, where we go from here. Yeah. Thank you for your information. So it sounds to me that policy has been constructed around the most dangerous, potentially dangerous kind of situation. In other words, keeping in mind that these situations can be very dangerous, that's where the policy has been going, right?
These are safety protocols.
Yeah.
And questioning is part of a safety protocol.
All right, so I think the committee has to talk about what they want to do next, and you want to start, Gwen? What do you think our next steps should be?
Well, you've already got my opinion.
Yeah, but
I don't think
I understand your opinion,
Yeah.
and I'm mostly in agreement, but how do you want to proceed in terms of?
Well, I've listened to Lieutenant Montgomery, and I've taken in all his considerations, and I still feel that we need to come up with a policy where this is not done. There are tools, license plates you can check, identifications you can check, and I just don't think it's something that you need to be asking people's color if you're not gonna ask everyone else. So,
Do you, how would it be, well, Terry, why don't you go? How would you like to proceed? Not in terms of what your opinions are at this moment, but procedurally, what do you think we should do next?
I have one other question. When we say reasonable suspicion based on articulable facts, what does that mean to you?
So,
If you had a car stop,
I will
I
know.
mean, are those well-known criteria? They are.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
So reasonable suspicion is the standard for detention.
Yeah.
So, the legal standard is that the officer has specific articulable facts that give them reason to believe that crime may be afoot and that the person you're detaining may be a participant in that criminal activity. In the case of a car stop, a reasonable suspicion stop would be a detention stop where you're, for example, stopping a car because you've had a rash of burglaries and a car's coming out of a closed business at 3 a.m. where it's been burglarized before. You might have reasonable suspicion to believe that perhaps this relates to the burglaries and that this person, due to the hour and due to the fact that, the business is closed, may need to investigate whether this person was in fact related to the burglaries that have been occurring in that area.
Mhm.
So that would be a detention, and it just so happens that the person is in a car, right? If they were on foot and related to the burglaries, you would make a pedestrian stop, but in the case of a car stop, the other way a car gets stopped is when you know that somebody committed a violation of law, that you have probable cause to believe they ran a stop sign or had a blinker
But
out.
assuming a normal traffic stop, like the situation we've been talking about, minor,
Right.
running a stop sign or something,
blinker.
what would be reasonable suspicion to do a search?
So in order to do a search, absent
Absent, yeah.
probation or parole,
Mhm.
we would need probable cause to do a search.
Right, and what are examples of that?
So,
What's your criteria?
for example, if, trying to think, walk up to the car and, the car billows out a bunch of smoke of marijuana. And,
That was then, but now they're doing it, I mean, you know
I know,
what
but
I'm
you know,
saying?
it's still not legal to
Okay.
drive
Well, I
smoke,
would
right?
think it shouldn't be, but.
Right, so I guess.
But your situation where you saw somebody pass over something and it looked like they were hiding something, would that have been turned into reasonable suspicion?
Yeah, I would keep digging into that to try to understand what happened. I'd keep investigating.
You
But
could
that-
have used that as reasonable suspicion.
I would have, from there, I would have built resources. What I'm saying to you is that I didn't think I had the car yet. I knew
Yeah.
something was going on. My attention level was raised, and I was gonna keep investigating. And part of that investigative question was, are you on probation or parole? Like, how am I gonna get to figure out what I need to figure out about what that was, what's going on there? So in the case of,
Suppose the guy says no, that car where you thought something was being passed, and he says, no, I'm not. Then what do you do?
so he said no, he wasn't. So that in and of itself is an assessment tool as well. So did he say no in a way that was nervous and believable? Did he say no while fidgeting with stuff in the center console? How did he say no? Was he sweating while he said no? Was he, mad while he said, but like the different things that could make you say like, oh, I believe that no, or something's going on, there's more going on here. Combined with these factors, he was speeding down the street. He made this abrupt turn when he saw me. Did he do that because of me? I don't know. I'm going to investigate.
Could that be used as reasonable suspicion then?
It could build towards a reasonable suspicion. But again,
My
probable
point here-
cause to search the vehicle.
Yeah, my point here is, you had proposed no searches without reasonable suspicion. And what I'm concerned about here is if you just sort of ban asking if they're on probation or parole, if that's asking to put more pressure on officers to be more lenient about how they judge reasonable suspicion. Because they have, personal liabilities out there in terms of stopping these cars. I mean, it's a dangerous business. And so, they're gonna try to protect themselves wherever they can, I think. And then that can turn into what would look like racial profiling or something. It's like, well, with these guys, you make up reasonable suspicion, and these guys you don't, or
Well,
something.
how about doing a record check? It seems to me a record check would be more reliable. You say it's not always reliable because the name is different.
I
It seems like it'd
understand
be
the
more
record
reliable
check
than
thing, it's the timing that's the key.
So I've spent 15 minutes, 20 minutes trying to figure out somebody's name when I know they're lying to me.
Right,
Doing
but,
records checks and doing.
but the
various
record
things.
check might be more reliable than asking the individual.
It could be, but however, because it can fail sometimes is not a reason to not do it. You see what I'm saying? Because it doesn't work the way it works. Sometimes it's not a reason to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sometimes it works really well and really allows us to take some safety control of the
Yeah.
situation.
So,
To me, it's like, because the record check I thought was a reasonable way to go. And, and until I got to thinking about, well, what if he has to go back to the car and all that?
But he's
Well,
already
Lieutenant
looked at
Montgomery
the
says he
license
doesn't
plate.
have to go back to the car, huh?
You've already looked at the license plate.
Possibly not,
But
if
most
he's
of the
got a
time, when
license
you're getting
plate.
behind a car, you're looking at the license plate.
The license
If they have a license
The
plate.
license plate will tell you who the registered.
90% of the people have a license plate.
Yeah.
The license plate will only tell you information that's been attached to that license plate about the registered owner, or information that's been attached to that car. When we get up to the car, many times we find that it's not the registered owner driving the car, that it's
Right.
occupied by multiple people. And so the license plate could tell you everything you need to know about who the registered owner is, and you may come up to the window and find the registered owner there. You may come up and find anybody they lent the car to.
Yeah. Well, anyway, my thing was, well, if you could do a reasonable search about probation or parole, while you're standing there at the car you stopped, and have that be.
If they do it to you, that's fine.
Pardon?
But if you're doing it to other segment of the population,
No, I'm just
that's what the
talking-
issue
no.
is, that's why we're here. We're
No.
not here for all this other stuff. We're here to get some type of resolution. If you're going to do it, I don't have a problem do it to everyone.
Yeah.
If you're not gonna do it that way, then it should be taken off the table.
No, my point was, it wasn't about asking, it was about finding out. It was like if you came up to a car, you stopped the car, right? You had a car stop, you came up to the window, you said blah, 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 whatever, asked the person for their ID or whatever. If you could then sort of run quickly
That's what you should do.
probation or parole check
Mhm.
without asking them anything,
Mhm.
right? That would be a reasonable place to go for me, because it could be something that you wouldn't have to ask them about it. On the other hand, Lieutenant Montgomery says, well, that takes a while sometimes. And then it becomes, well,
It's
you
also
know,
a problem for me, I have to say, because that record check would only be done in the same community that's being asked, right?
in the what?
In the same community of color that the record check is a substitute for asking the question, right? That's what we're saying. The record check would replace asking the question.
Right.
Right. My
With
point
anyone.
is that the same
Yeah.
discretion would be used on the record check that's used on the question. That is, it would be disproportionately used for people of color,
It could be.
leading to disproportionate searches of their cars. So, maybe we wanna go back home and have our homework be, look again at the Oakland policy, read carefully what I wrote up, because I spent most of the day on Friday writing that up, looking up the case law and all that sort of thing. There's no question in the case law and in the penal code that this is absolutely the police officer's right. Question is whether we wanna put limits. So, if the three of us can, with Lieutenant Montgomery's information that he's provided and with what we've learned collectively, look at those two documents and, see what you can agree with, what we disagree with. We might not, the three of us might not come to a unanimous decision about
Right.
this, but we could eventually take something to the commission.
Yeah.
How's that sound?
Could I point something out
Sure.
about what you just said that kind of piqued my interest was, in the case of the answer is yes, I'm on probation or parole, we should be disproportionately searching people on probation or parole.
Yes, that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, what I'm saying is we should, when we find out, regardless
Yes.
of race, that somebody is on probation or parole,
That's when you search.
we should be searching.
Yes,
So
I
that
know.
will cause a disproportion based on who's on probation or
Yes,
parole.
but given that you only, let's take as a hypothetical, I know you disagree with this, but let's
Well, say it first and I'll
assume,
tell you if I
let's,
disagree.
let's assume that the probation and parole question and/or records check is used disproportionately for young men of color. When the answer is yes, you then are allowed to check their vehicles. So it's the original question that is possibly discriminatory, that leads to the I'm not saying wrong searches, but the discriminatory searches, because they are the ones who are being asked this question. If you don't ask the question, you can't do a fourth waiver search, right?
So you're right, I don't agree with the way you constructed that. So
I mean,
the
with the
conclusions you've made,
Yeah.
Well, if you found out in the records they were on probation or parole, you could do a search, right?
and you
wouldn't
want,
have to ask them.
and you want to, I mean, like I said, if you went to Berkeley side and you looked at the guns, we
Yeah.
don't cover because the question was asked, or.
But my point is, if you're trying to go towards, they're only gonna do a records check on certain people, that doesn't have to be. They could do a record check on everyone.
Yeah.
I don't know why I wouldn't want to, if you could do something
Well, because we
speedy.
don't wanna move towards I would prefer not having it done at all, but, to do it of everyone just suddenly seems pretty intrusive of
Yeah.
everyone,
Well,
It
if they're
is
not
often-
talking to them about it, it does.
Excuse me?
If they're not talking to them about it, it
Yeah,
doesn't, it's
check
like they
it.
run the record, it's just like they run your license plate,
Yeah.
right? It's like you don't talk to them about it, it's like, well, it's just part of the car stop, and you run the record.
Those are just part of a car stop, the need to know is there, the reasons for running a records check on somebody is there, the,
Right.
upheld as lawful.
And let me just ask one other thing. If it's a ped stop, right? How do you deal with it then? There's nothing, you would get an ID and then you could run a register check with the ID if they had an ID, right?
You might get an ID or they might tell you their name.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Right.
we would go through this very similar steps,
Yeah.
Because, you know, we take these searches, they're sort of, they're intrusive, right? You're gonna be searching
Right,
somebody's
right.
car, you're gonna be searching somebody's person, it's an intrusion on their Fourth Amendment rights, it's one that the law has said is, because of the government interest in enforcing
Mhm.
probation and parole is important enough to make that
Mhm.
intrusion. You also know that when you're intruding on somebody, that it can be upsetting, that they can react poorly, that there's safety issues, safety concerns. If they know they're doing something wrong, they may then try to escape or fight because they know they're about to be caught.
Mhm.
So, yeah, we would ask those questions in the same way, and we would sort of try to take the same
Right.
level of control so that people don't get hurt because they make a
Right.
bad choice to fight, or to flee or whatever.
Just two other quick things. One is, the probation or parole thing does not deal with issues about, do you have any drugs in the car? Do you have any blah, 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 blah. Those, you know, it isn't, it sounds like to me it's just not probation or parole. And so the question would be, are they you know, is that a problem? If they're not asking if you're on probation or parole, say, do you have any drugs in the car, do you have any blah, blah, I don't know what your other questions are.
You know,
But
one of the typical ones is, you got any guns, knives, or bazookas in the car, anything dangerous that can hurt me?
you have any what?
Any guns, knives, or
Yeah, any
bazookas, or
drug- yeah.
anything dangerous in the car that you don't have
Right.
anything illegal or dangerous in the car?
Right.
And some people will say, yeah, I have a gun under my seat. And
So
so
my point being is that if that's an issue in the community, you think that it's an issue, I don't really know, I didn't get anything like that asked of me, but, if you think it's an issue, it doesn't just stop at probation and parole. I mean, it's about if you're asking other questions that presume some kind of guilt or something or other.
Well, if
see
you
what I'm
ask the
saying?
person if they're on probation or parole,
Yeah,
most of the time, well, 100% of the time, your record will show what you're on there for. It could be drug related, it could be, maybe you had a weapon, I don't know, it could be a whole lot of things. They don't have to just come out and ask you, do you have drugs on you or whatever. When you ask a person if they're on probation or parole, most of the time, it's certain categories that you have been put in jail for, which is gonna show up.
But
One might be drugs, maybe it might be weapons, maybe it might be domestic abuse, I don't know. But I'm just saying, all that would come out when you run their ID.
well, if you run your ID, but presuming in the moment that we're saying, well, we're gonna stop asking if you're on probation or parole. That doesn't stop them from asking other things about drugs or guns or anything like that. And so, I
Terry
just
said
don't wanna
that
ignore
potentially
that
could be
point.
offensive
You see
too.
what I mean? It's
Yeah.
like, let's say they're not gonna ask for
Right,
probation and
right,
parole
right,
anymore. They're
right.
gonna come up to you and say stuff,
Oh,
hey, do you have any
drugs
guns in the
on
car? You got any
gun,
drugs?
Yeah,
in-"
yeah, so
Right.
then
So-
you'd have to,
So
you'd
the,
have to.
well, the crux of the issue
Yeah.
is not the question. It's the feeling that the question was only asked because of race. The question, we have to be able to ask hard questions that are offensive. I have to ask men if they beat their kids. I have to ask somebody if they sexually assaulted somebody. That is a potentially offensive question. Police officers, in order to investigate crime, have to talk about things that are more sensitive.
Right, but that's when you have
Right.
some facts that lead
Right,
you.
like I wouldn't
Right,
ask this,
right.
I wouldn't ask this at a barbecue of my friends, you know what I mean, because it would offend people, you know what I mean? But in the context of policing, we have to ask tough questions and difficult questions. The crux of the issue is that people, to tackle, what we need to tackle is people feeling like we're only asking that because of race. That's the crux of the issue to tackle. I would submit to you if
He's
we.
saying you probably, he's saying he imagines you only ask people of color also if they have guns or
Yeah, so
something.
I would
I'm not saying that would happen, I'm saying it could happen.
It does happen.
And so what I'm worried
sure
about,
it
here's
does
what I'm
happen.
worried about. If we just say you can't ask the question, then I would be fine with that if the system we knew would work quickly.
Right.
Because there's a danger to officers to prolong their time with someone in a car that is dangerous. You know what I mean? So, if it was a quick check, I'd think that would be a good thing. On the other hand, if we ban asking the question of, are you on probation or parole, I think it's gonna have a tendency to have officers rely more on making a judgment about reasonable suspicion and asking more questions that otherwise
Right.
they wouldn't maybe ask necessarily. Do you have drugs in the car? Do you have guns in your car? Do you have not? It's like, geez, they ask that of me, it's like, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
It's just going a little far, isn't it?
Mhm.
So it
Well,
isn't,
see, you
I
feel how
just.
you feel. If they ask you that,
Of
you would be
course.
like,
Oh, yeah,
taken
of course.
aback.
Yeah,
Well,
of course, you would too.
yeah.
And so I'm just thinking, about, I think we need to think a little bit about just the idea of banning the question has other repercussions that could be, officers are gonna do what they need to do to protect themselves, I think. It isn't about racial profiling, it's more about, well, gee, I gotta stop here, I need to make sure that things are gonna be safe for everyone, you know what I mean? So I think they're gonna rely on the tools they have. And so I think we just have to be careful about how are we
Are we
fashioning it.
assuming that people, and we seem to be assuming that people on probation and parole are more dangerous than the average person.
That's exactly what they're assuming.
And
That's not
I've
always true. It depends on
I've
what
spent
you're
a lot
on
of
it for.
time
Right.
with prisoners.
Yeah.
I've done a lot of
Yeah.
research in prison, and I've taught in prison for years, and I've spent a lot of time with prisoners. And to get out on parole, it's a high bar, especially if it's a violent offense. First of all, it was probably 20 years ago. And I would trust my life with those people. Now, you have different experience, I can tell from your face, but we're assuming here that once you find out they're on probation or parole, you now know they're dangerous. And I just think that's an
Stereotype.
an
So,
unfortunate
yeah.
assumption.
So
It is.
we are not making that assumption. I am not making that assumption. But like I said earlier, sometimes you find somebody and you say, that's a good guy trying to get their life back together. They're on probation or parole, they made some mistakes. We start with the presumption that all our stops are potentially dangerous, because
Yeah.
that's how you make sure you're safe for all of your stops. And sometimes it's the stop you didn't see coming that becomes the most dangerous. You had no idea it becomes the most dangerous. A couple of years ago, we did a training where I studied 5 years worth of officers killed on car stops in the United States, from the law enforcement officers killed and assaulted, the database from the FBI. And I studied that and dismantled when on a car stop cops are getting killed. And then we put all of our officers through a training. And we told them how to use tactics so that they can minimize the possibility of being killed or assaulted on a car stop. That is the phenomenon. The danger is not based on an erroneous assumption. It starts with the assumption not that these particular people in this particular situation in their life are dangerous, but that car stops in and of themselves are dangerous encounters.
Okay, so how do we wanna proceed? We really don't wanna go too far over time.
Right, okay.
What do you wanna do?
You said you wanna
Well, I
review-
thought that it could be useful to, go back to the drawing board, go back to our documents that we have,
Right.
especially the Oakland policy and the thing I wrote up, and
Right.
whatever else you wanna bring to the
Okay.
table. And draft
agree.
some kind of like response, either to do something different with the policy or not, or, I see you.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to be able to think it through a little bit more, maybe come up with something too.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we could
Yeah.
all come up with our
Yeah.
thoughts on, gee, now we know more about
Right.
it, how could we propose to do something here?
Yeah. Okay, and thank you for your time, and,
Sure.
Thank
yeah,
you.
Yeah.
very very,
Do you wanna
very
set
useful.
another meeting, or should we just set,
Do what?
we
Set
wanna
another meeting?
Yeah, we're
Um,
gonna come back and talk one more time then?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't we say what, in 2 weeks? Or what do you wanna do?
Is next week too soon?
Well, it might be because we have our other meeting and I wanna be
Well,
able
the
to
other
really-
meeting is, would be, if it's 2 weeks from now, the other meeting would be
We
the
would
next
have
day.
a meeting. No,
We don't have a meeting
This coming week,
We don't have one this Wednesday.
okay.
It's the following Wednesday.
This is the 18th.
If we waited for 2 weeks, we'd have
That's
the PRC meeting the
25th
day
for
after.
the PRC,
The meeting's the 26th.
26th.
I'm not gonna be here around the 4th, so,
Oh, okay.
just before and just after.
No, but next week is the
I leave.
25th.
Yeah.
Right, it's our meeting. So you're talking about meet the day before?
Oh, next week.
See,
is
that's
our
what I'm
meeting. Yeah,
trying to
yeah,
make sure we're not,
You wanna,
because we have our
and 2 weeks,
PRC to,
2 weeks after
review.
that is the 3rd. I mean, the week after
Look at my
next is what,
calendar.
Terry, look at your calendar.
I have mine.
I have my calendar, yeah.
Yeah. What's
What do you
2
think?
weeks from today? What date is that?
The 2nd.
18, 17.
You wanna do it then?
25
Hmm?
is
You wanna meet then?
the second?
I'm not back till the 6th.
Oh, he's back on 6, okay, let me just see what we're doing.
So it would either have to be before the 25th, like next week?
I'd prefer to
or
have it next week,
It would
but,
have to be.
you know, cause otherwise
For
then
me,
we
it
have to
would be
wait,
like
we have to wait
9th
3
or
weeks
something.
otherwise.
Hmm?
Otherwise, we have to wait 3 weeks for you to
Okay,
be
so
back.
we're here, so next week, I'm just feeling that, the following day is the PRC, and we always have a bulk of material.
Yeah,
So
we
I'm
do.
just trying to not be inundated with all of, with this on top of
Okay,
what
but
we're
if we wait
doing.
until the 2nd,
The second,
Terry's not back.
Terry's back on the, when are you back?
6th.
Terry? Oh, you're not back till the 6th.
Yeah.
Well,
So it would be something more like,
How about,
What
it
is the
doesn't have to be
20th?
Tuesday, how about after our meeting, after the 26th? Oh, no, the 27th, I'm out of town.
Okay.
All right, we don't need to hold everybody up on this.
Okay,
We'll put it
okay,
on the
okay,
agenda.
we'll
We can
figure
do
it out.
We'll figure it
Okay.
out after.
Thank you so
Yes,
much
but
for
we're gonna
coming.
public-
I'm enlightened by what you shared with us.
Thank you for
So,
sharing your
yeah,
perspective, I appreciate
yeah.
it, yeah.
Before
yeah, I
I
appreciate you
adjourn.
coming.
I think
I
we
really
can
do.
come up with
Yeah,
something,
that's-
yeah.
Do you
Okay.
have
We're
public comment?
Yeah, we're gonna public comment.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, I
Oh, yeah.
appreciate it. Sorry to be behind you, but I can't be on camera and do this,
Okay.
so. I just wanted to thank everybody for their input today. I thought it was spectacular communication, and actually having the police here actually added to the conversation, and I appreciate your presence. And just for, listening today, I was thinking myself that asking the question would actually prevent escalation in certain circumstances, and use of force would probably be lowered because of if you didn't ask it, what potentially could occur. And so what I'm thinking is that actually it'd be best for all parties if we did ask the question. For instance, if there was some criminal in the car, he was asked the question, and he said, yes, he was on probation, then they could proceed, and it would be peaceful, supposedly, versus if they didn't, and it was an unsafe situation, and he had to go to his car or whatever, and that gave time to arise to a bad situation, then we have a situation where we could have asked and we didn't, and it could turn into a gunfight, and even the criminal or the officer could be dead. So I hope that was understandable.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay,
Thanks.
thank you.
Okay, meeting adjourned.
Okay,
And then the
thank
3 of
you.
us can figure out when we meet.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lieutenant.
Yeah. Happy to help.